Hello folks, I hope you're having a great day today. Today we're going to be taking a look at another book in the Louise Cooper trilogy. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Outcast, which is the middle book in the Time Master trilogy. Last week we looked at the first book in this series, The Initiate. It was published in 1985. This book is published the next year, 1986. I picked up this book, the first book, The Initiate, when I was in college from a local bookstore when I was living at WVU at Morgantown, West Virginia. And I liked it a lot, and so I picked up the rest of the trilogy and read that while I was there. And then I've never actually gone back and reread it later on. And I thought that I was kind of in the mood to do it. I do like that it feels like a throwback. The central conflict in this novel is law versus chaos, not good versus evil, which I think is particularly interesting. I think there's a lot of fun things happening with that dynamic. It feels more like the 60s when you had and early 70s when you had Chronicles of Amber and Eternal Champion were big sellers in the fantasy genre. It feels like early Dungeons & Dragons when your central conflict was law and chaos before Advanced Dungeons & Dragons came out and added the good versus evil layer to it. So it has that kind of an old school feel to it, which I like, even though it's published in the mid-80s. And so it's a bit of a throwback. Central conflict, and unlike some of those other ones where you're a key person, like in the Chronicles of Amber, your key protagonists in the House of Amber are servants of order. Here, our key protagonist, Terrid, is a servant of chaos. And so what's going to wind up happening in the second book, and this will give light spoilers to what happens in the first book, so I'm giving you a spoiler warning now, but what winds up happening at the end of the first book. He's sentenced to death, and he escapes death by stopping time, and the pendulum of time stops. He wins basically a battle of mental illness against the literal pendulum of time, and he stops time itself, and time encapsulates himself and all the people that are trying to kill him, and that's kind of the end of the novel. He's now living by himself in this castle. And now we're going to be introduced to one of his potential love interests in the first novel, who he doesn't wind up going with. And we're going to be introduced to her. She's going to be the major protagonist of book 2, Scylla. And she winds up getting to the castle through magical means, through a warp storm, which is sometimes how you teleport during these nasty storms in this world. Our protagonist, Terrid, was teleported from a warp storm early on in the first novel, and she'll teleport early on in the second novel near the castle with another person who tries to grab her, a local son of the firstborn son of a major ruler called the Margraves in the society. So he's the heir to a Margrave, and he will act like an heir to the Margrave too. He's not a particularly nice or notable character. And anyway, the two of them will get teleported to the castle where Terrid is. And they'll meet Terrid a while after book 1, early on in book 2, and then what winds up happening is that slowly the two people will slowly draw closer and closer together, and ultimately they'll fall for each other, and so there's a lot of romance in this fantasy novel. And there's a lot of things that happen. Now this is a fantasy world. It's actually relatively low on the fantasy ratings in terms of traditional fantasy. In a heroic fantasy setting, you might come across dragons and massive amounts of magic, and healing potions that will heal your wounds, and that sort of thing. That's not really this magic world. There's no orcs, there's no elves, there's no dwarves. There's no dragons, right? There's not this traditional sort of mythological aspects. There's just basically magic, and very few people can use it. And that's pretty much it. There's really, with one exception of a creature that you will experience early on, that's it. That's really the only exception to this. It's really just much more of a lower fantasy sort of thing than a traditional sort of high fantasy world in the mid-80s would have, like, for example, Dungeons & Dragons is Dragons of Autumn, the Dragonlance Chronicles, which are very high fantasy, which are being published about the same time. And that's these sorts of things that are coming out in the mid-80s. And this is sort of a counter example that's much less lower fantasy, but still has all the sort of high fantasy embellishments, but without the world building. that happens. So this is the world that Louise Cooper builds here is much more interesting. It's much more things are happening, and I really enjoy this story. This story is less epic than the previous one. She's biting off less. I gave the first book a 7 out of 10. This feels more like a 6.5 or 6.4. So I'm going to round this down probably more to a 6 out of 10. It keeps you interested, keeps you engaged. You're never bored. Louise Cooper's a solid writer. She's not somebody I would go to the mattresses for, but she's fine. She's worth your time. She published a lot of novels during her time, but her Wikipedia page actually doesn't have a whole lot of stuff in it. Like, for example, there's not a single one of her novels that has a Wikipedia page dedicated to it. But she's fine. She's definitely somebody that I think, definitely want to go back and take a look at. Especially if you're in the mood for a this is great if you're in the mood for a throwback earlier fantasy story that has essential law versus chaos conflict to it. Although there are some timbers of good versus evil too. A lot of the language sometimes is couched in law versus evil, so it's not exclusively law versus chaos. There are the occasional good versus evil sort of languages that are used. The servants of law definitely think they're on the side of good, and they definitely think that the servants of chaos are on the side of evil. So that language is sometimes used. The law versus chaos language isn't used literally in every single time for the conflict. She does use other words for it, but she does sometimes couch it in a good versus evil form. But you can tell by their actions that the two chaotic characters that are in here will regularly act good, and the two lawful and many of the lawful people will act very chaotically and evilly. So there are definitely sort of these sort of styles, and it definitely feels more in some ways like it's a battle between chaos and law, sure, but there are more, and good versus evil obviously too, in a sense, but there's more to it than that when you start to see the actual actions that are happening to take place in the novel. In this novel series. I'm going to finish the final one, which is the Master of the Time Master Trilogy by Louise Cooper, and this one's published in '87. And then there you are. I'll go ahead and bring you to it. There's a novel. Have you read this novel? Have you heard of the Time Master series? Have you always wanted to read it? Have you heard of Louise Cooper, but you've never actually given her a shot? I recommend doing it. This is a good, fun throwback series that you can definitely enjoy. And go back to from the 80s. It's cheap on Amazon in the secondary market, so you can pick it up pretty cheaply, and it's worth your time. This is probably a 9. It's just 310 pages, and probably took me about 9 or 10 hours for me to knock out, because she's a denser writer. It takes more of your time to read her stuff. At least that's what I found. So it was definitely I knocked it out in 5 days, about an hour and a half, 2 hours a day, and it was fun. And again, definitely worth your time. So there you are. There is the second novel in the series, The Outcast by Louise Cooper. I'll go ahead and leave you to it. What did you think of the series? I'd be more than happy to engage you with it further in the comments below, whatever your take is on this series. If you like this, please feel encouraged. Hit that subscribe button. There's going to be a lot more of these videos to follow. And then finally, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day and investing it in watching my video. We all have so many things that are happening in our lives, and we're pulled in so many different directions. So the fact that you spent this time with me is incredibly humbling, and I appreciate it. So thanks again, and have an amazing day.